Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. 100 years ago, in typically insane fashion, the U.S. government was about to create a drought. The government had decided that beer was evil, they declared it to be a medicine, and were about to ban it. But that's not the drought this video is about. 100 years ago, there was a worldwide record heat wave and drought which threatened millions of people with starvation. I'm going to be showing you a lot of newspaper pages in this video, but I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them. If you want to read them in detail, go to my website. The description of this video below includes a link to the newspaper articles. The heat wave and drought of 1921 lasted for almost the entire year and covered almost the entire planet. It was particularly severe in Eastern Europe, Russia, and Asia. It was also a year of record flooding in Europe and the United States. Pueblo, Colorado lost about 1,500 people in a flood during June of 1921. Here's what the San Francisco Examiner reported during November of 1921. Corn is largely burnt up in Virginia, the Carolinas, New York, Ohio, Indiana, Kentucky, Missouri, Iowa, and Kansas. With Russia, the whole of Europe, Asia, Canada, Mexico parched. We see indeed that the drought is worldwide. No wonder the heat wave struck Spitsbergen and caused the Esquimos to throw away their furs and organize bathing parties, while the reindeer and game suffered terribly. I'm going to come back later and discuss the heat in Spitsbergen during 1921 and 1922. But right now I'm going to quickly move through some more descriptions of the heat and drought of 1921. It was terrible all over Europe. In Switzerland, the drought was severe and unprecedented. Glaciers were rapidly melting and causing great floods and avalanches. England, Ireland, France, and Spain had almost no rain from January through August. The water supply of Paris was threatened, and at Bordeaux the vineyards were parched almost beyond recovery. The weather was much worse 100 years ago, and another thing that was different then is that newspapers were actually interested in reporting news and science. The San Francisco Examiner ran a series of articles explaining how the drought was related to the behavior of the sun and the rest of the solar system. And in fact, scientists had correlated the climate to things going on outside of our solar system. The astonishing theory that the disastrous heat and drought of the summer were due to our solar system passing through a vast unseen cosmic cloud at a time when sunspots were hottest. Newspapers now simply blame fossil fuels and humans for everything going on the planet. Doing propaganda is much easier for them than doing actual news reporting or studying science. I would definitely recommend going to my website and reading these 1921 articles in detail. There's quite a bit of important scientific information presented there. You can see that scientists 100 years ago actually were interested in understanding the climate rather than simply saying what's necessary for them to get more research money. The heat and drought of 1921 continued through the winter. The U.S. Weather Bureau reported the Arctic seems to be warming up. Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas about Spitsbergen in the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions and hitherto unheard of high temperatures in that part of the Earth's surface. Many old landmarks are so changed as to be unrecognizable. Where formerly great masses of ice were found, they are now often moraines, accumulations of earth and stones. At many points where glaciers formerly extended far into the sea, they have entirely disappeared. There was a tremendous amount of warming reported around Spitsbergen, and during the winter of 1921-1922, the ocean did not freeze over even on the north coast of Spitsbergen. This map showed what happened during the winter of 1921 through 1922. The black area shows the extent of the ice, which never got close to Spitsbergen that winter. Now let's compare that to the spring of 2020 when Spitsbergen was almost completely surrounded by thick ice. You can see that there was a lot more ice in the eastern Arctic in 2020 than there was in 1921. And in early 1922, the Arctic explorer Stephenson reported that the ice between the North Pole and Alaska was young, thin, moving, rotten ice. Climate alarmists tell us now that the ice 100 years ago was very thick in this part of the Arctic, but the historical record shows us otherwise. In 1939, it was reported that winter temperatures around Spitsbergen had warmed up nearly 16 degrees since 1910. Dr. Hans Ullmann, the leading Arctic expert at the time, said all of the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting, and it may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers of eastern Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. In 1948, Dr. Ullmann wrote this paper documenting the retreat of the glaciers and the incredible increase in warmth around Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic. He showed more than 7 degrees Celsius warming around Spitsbergen over a 20-year period. And in that paper, he documented the tremendous retreat of glaciers in Norway. This photograph was 1869, 1933, and 1946. The glacier had largely disappeared. We know that 1921 was an unprecedented hot and dry year, and the Arctic ice was rapidly disappearing. But if we look at the current NASA temperature graph for the planet, we can see that they show 1921 as being one of the coldest years on record. This graph is completely absurd and does not represent reality. Now I'm going to show you a little bit of detail about how NASA and NOAA have destroyed the global temperature record over the last 20 years. In 1988, NASA's James Hansen appeared before the U.S. Senate and told them global warming has begun, and he told them that we need to get rid of fossil fuels. But at the time, the key people in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration weren't interested in Hansen's nonsense. This was the front page of the New York Times on January 26, 1989, a few months after Hansen's testimony. NOAA published a report saying U.S. data since 1895 failed to show warming trend. And if we look at the actual measured temperature data from NOAA, we can see what they were talking about. There's been a sharp decline in afternoon temperatures in the United States since the 1930s, and 1921 was the second hottest year on record. Later in 1989, NOAA again disputed Hansen's claim. Tom Carl was in charge of climate data at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration for many decades. He reported in 1989 that analysis of warming since 1881 shows most of the increase in global temperature happened before 1919, before the more recent sharp rise in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. While global climate warmed overall since 1881, it actually cooled from 1921 to 1979. 30 years ago, government scientists knew that 1921 was a peak year for temperatures, and that temperatures cooled quite a bit after 1921. But as I showed you earlier, the government agencies have erased this, and now NASA shows 1921 as being one of the coldest years on record. Now let's look at how NOAA has also altered their data. In 1981, NOAA said that most global warming had occurred before 1919. But the current NOAA graph shows cooling from 1881 to 1919. It's pretty incredible that they turned the period of peak warming into a period of cooling. And in 1989, NOAA said that Earth cooled from 1921 to 1979. But now NOAA shows lots of warming from 1921 to 1979. Over the past 30 years, NOAA has rewritten Earth's history to turn warming into cooling and cooling into warming. Remember that there's more ice around Svalbard now than there was in 1921. Ice doesn't lie, but climate scientists do. And Disney is about to come out with a propaganda film about warming and retreat of glaciers around Svalbard, or as it's sometimes called, Spitsbergen. They say that Svalbard has warmed about 4 degrees Celsius since 1971, which is less than the warming that occurred there in the early part of the last century. Disney will focus on how the warming affects the indigenous people. But 100 years ago, the heat wave that struck Spitsbergen caused the Eskimos to throw away their furs and organize bathing parties, while the reindeer and game suffered terribly. The reality is that there's nothing new going on in the eastern Arctic. It warmed tremendously from 1900 through about 1940, then cooled through the end of the 1970s and has warmed since then. The warming and cooling in the eastern Arctic correlates with the Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, which is an ocean circulation pattern. But most people don't know how warm the planet used to be because government agencies tamper with the data to erase the heat of the past and increase the warmth of the present. Modern climate science is largely based on fraudulent data from government agencies. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on these scamsters for the past 14 years. You can visit him on the web and read these articles in more detail at realclimatescience.com.